The first shot shattered the silence like a thunderclap. Then came the second clean controlled landing dead center. Petty Officer James Carter flinched. He'd just botched his own grouping at 25 yards, scattering rounds across the outer rings like a rookie. His instructor hadn't even needed to speak. The look said enough. But what caught James's attention wasn't his own failure. It was the sound from lane 15. He turned just as the third and fourth shots rang out, each one spaced perfectly, each impact punching the paper target in the exact same spot. His instructor paused too, eyebrows rising. "Who the hell is that?" James muttered, squinting down the line. At the far corner of the precision point shooting range, a solitary figure in a red flannel shirt stood firm. Gray-haired back slightly hunched, he moved with deliberate economy, loading, breathing, aiming. The pistol in his hands looked ancient. The man himself looked invisible. Until now. James stepped off the mat and walked closer. Curiosity overriding protocol. The older man didn't notice him at first. He was focused, adjusting his stance, his grip steady despite the obvious stiffness in his knees. It was only when he paused to reload that James caught a glimpse of something beneath the rolled-up sleeve. A tattoo faded ink nearly lost to age and sun, but unmistakable. A skull in a marine cover. The words below swift, silent, deadly. James froze. That insignia wasn't decoration. It was history. Force Recon, lead among elites, the kind of warriors they studied in training but rarely met in real life. And certainly not in flannel shirts and worn-out jeans. Sir James asked cautiously, stepping into the older man's periphery, "Your shooting is incredible. May I ask where you learned to shoot like that?" The man looked up, his expression unreadable. His eyes were ice blue, clear, alert, heavy. "Here and there," he said flatly, "picked it up along the way." James offered a hand. "Petty Officer James Carter, Navy SEAL candidate." The old man gave a small nod. "Franklin Ward." A beat passed. "That tattoo," James said carefully. Force Recon. Franklin's hand instinctively pulled down the sleeve. His voice dropped. "That was a long time ago. Different life." But James saw it now, the stillness, the precision, the presence. This wasn't just an old man shooting holes in paper. This was a warrior tucked in plain sight. What no one realized, not the instructors, not the other recruits focused on their drills, was that today they weren't just training. They were in the presence of a man who had once walked where few dared, and they were about to find out exactly what that meant. James Carter didn't return to his lane. He couldn't. Not after what he'd just seen. Instead, he approached lane 10 slowly, respectfully, the way one might approach a monument they just realized wasn't made of stone, but of history. Franklin Ward was methodically reloading his M11 fingers, moving with the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need to prove anything. His stance hadn't shifted, nor had his pace. But now that James had seen the faded Force Recon tattoo on his forearm, everything was different. "Excuse me, sir," James said, keeping a professional distance. "I couldn't help but notice your shooting. It's exceptional." Franklin didn't look up at first. He finished placing the last round into his magazine, slid it into the weapon, and set it down on the table. Only then did he meet the young man's eyes, blue-gray, weathered, steady. "You Navy?" Franklin asked, voice low and even. "Petty Officer James Carter, sir. SEAL candidate. Phase 2. Franklin nodded once. "You've got a good eye." James hesitated, then said what he knew had to be true. "That tattoo, Force Recon, right?" Franklin's fingers twitched instinctively, tugging at the edge of his flannel sleeve to cover it. His jaw clenched. The question had opened something he usually kept buried. "A long time ago," Franklin said quietly. "Different war, different man." James didn't push. Instead, he simply said, "With respect, sir, guys who wore that ink aren't just history, they're legacy." Something shifted in Franklin's expression. Not softening, just recalibrating. He saw something in James, not hero, worship, but hunger for truth. "You want to know about Force Recon?" Franklin finally said, picking up his pistol and unloading it again. "It's not what they put in the documentaries." Word traveled fast on a range, especially among men trained to detect shifts in atmosphere. Within minutes, a handful of SEAL trainees had begun to drift toward lane 10, rifles slung and ear protection in hand, quietly taking up spots on nearby benches. Franklin noticed but didn't protest. I served with First Force Recon out of Camp Pendleton, he began slowly. 3 tours, Vietnam, 66 to 70, mostly in places the Pentagon didn't admit we were in. The air changed again. Even the instructors had paused their own drills, now subtly drifting closer. We weren't just scouts, we were ghosts, dropped in behind enemy lines with 6 men and a map drawn from satellite guesswork. Sometimes we observed. Sometimes we eliminated targets. Other times, well, the mission changed halfway through. That's when it gets messy. One SEAL candidate, Thompson, raised a hand uncertain. Sir, how did you stay calm under that kind of pressure? Franklin considered that a long time before answering. You don't. Not really. You just do what has to be done. Your body moves before your brain catches up. But afterward, that's the part they don't train you for. James leaned forward. You mean the aftermath? Franklin nodded slowly. You spend the rest of your life carrying names you can't say out loud, missions you can't explain, and choices that you don't ever stop questioning. For a moment, the only sound was the distant crack of gunfire from the far side of the range. Franklin continued. I remember one op near Laos. We were tracking a courier, just a kid really, who was ferrying messages between enemy camps. Intel said he was a threat, so we set up an ambush. But when we closed in, he dropped the bag and ran straight into a village full of civilians. No backup, no drone feed. Just us trying to figure out whether one life was worth risking 10. He didn't finish the story. He didn't have to. The gravity in his voice said more than details ever could. We completed the mission, he said simply. But I left something behind that day, and I don't mean gear. James nodded slowly. Did you ever talk about it with anyone? Not until today. Franklin admitted. Not many people ask. Fewer know how to listen. For the next hour, Franklin demonstrated techniques most had never seen: tactical reloads, breath control, under adrenaline, the mental math of distance, and wind inside muscle memory. But the real lessons were quieter: how to live with a lifetime of classified silence, how to endure without becoming hollow. By the end of the session, none of the SEAL candidates saw Franklin as just an old man anymore. They stood when he did. They shook his hand. They thanked him not just for the war stories, but for the brutal honesty. As James Carter walked him to the exit, he asked one last question. Would you come back, sir? Maybe talk to more of the guys? Franklin paused by the door, looking out at the late afternoon sun, casting long shadows on the asphalt. I'll think about it, he said. But the glint in his eye, faint but undeniable, said more than words ever could. For the first time in decades, Franklin Ward had spoken not just of war, but of its weight. And in doing so, he'd passed something on. Not medals, not tactics, wisdom, the kind they don't issue with your weapon. The range had grown still, the air heavy with expectation, as Franklin Ward set down his pistol and rubbed his weathered hands together. Around him, the SEAL candidates were silent, not from boredom, but from something far deeper: respect and perhaps a bit of awe. What began as curiosity had become reverence. But what followed next would change how they saw not just Franklin, but themselves. Petty Officer James Carter, sitting cross-legged beside him, asked softly, Sir, was there ever a mission you regret? Franklin's jaw clenched. The question hung in the air like the weight of an unsent letter. He glanced at the floor, at the faint smudges of gunpowder and oil on the concrete. Then slowly he lifted his gaze to meet James's eyes. There was one, Franklin said, his voice low, almost gravelly. Cambodia, 1970. A couple of the instructors standing nearby glanced at each other. Even now, decades later, that word Cambodia carried a sharp edge. Franklin let the silence sit, and then he spoke again. It was off the books, he began. We were sent across the border to neutralize a North Vietnamese colonel who was allegedly coordinating supply lines. Intelligence said he was alone in a safe house. Franklin's fingers unconsciously traced the faint scar along his forearm, the same one near the tattoo that had started all of this. When we got there, it wasn't just him. His wife, 2 kids, 8 and 10, maybe they were there too, having dinner. A shift moved through the group. The story had taken a turn none of them expected. Our orders were simple, Franklin continued. Go into silent, confirm the target, eliminate. No exceptions, no witnesses. His eyes had gone distant, staring beyond the range and into something none of them could see. The colonel reached for a pistol. Reflex kicked in. I disabled him clean shot to the shoulder, but then the screaming started. His wife tried to cover the children. My second was ready to take them out. I stopped him. He said it flatly as if still convincing himself it was real. I took control of the room, secured the target, bound the wife and kids. We exfiltrated with the intel clean, no civilian deaths. Franklin paused. The younger men leaned forward. Some held their breath. I got court-martialed 6 weeks later. The words struck like a shot. For failure to execute mission parameters. They said I jeopardized operational integrity. I lost my rank, my clearance, my place in the Corps. His voice didn't crack, but his hands were trembling now. But I didn't lose my conscience. James swallowed hard. Sir, you did the right thing. Maybe Franklin said quietly, but it cost me everything. He looked around at the men in uniform still in the early chapters of their stories. You've been taught that success is measured in efficiency, in execution, in loyalty to command. But there will come a moment, if it hasn't already, when none of those things will give you the answer you need, and then you'll have to choose. One SEAL candidate, a lanky recruit with dark eyes and a fresh scar on his neck, asked, "And how do you live with that choice?" Shush. Franklin's lips pressed together. "You don't live with it," he said after a long moment. "You carry it." He looked up at the sky beyond the range window. "You carry the faces, the hesitation, the silence in your bunks at night, and you carry the stares of men who think you failed. You just keep walking." James's voice came softly. "But you saved lives," Franklin nodded, "and I lost my identity in the process. That's the real test. Not the trigger, not the mission. It's what comes after." There were no smart remarks, no casual nods, just silence, the kind that settles deep. Then for the first time that day, Franklin smiled, but it was a tired one. "You all want to be warriors. That's good. But remember, there's more to being a warrior than combat. There's the man you have to look at in the mirror afterward." As he packed up his pistol, no one offered to help, not out of neglect, but out of deference. They knew now who he was and what he had paid to remain himself. Before he stood, Franklin placed one hand gently on James Carter's shoulder. "You asked the right question, son. Just make sure when your moment comes you ask yourself what matters most, your record or your soul." And then he walked toward the exit, slow but upright, leaving behind not just silence, but a weight every man there would carry in his own way. The silence that followed Franklin Ward's story was not empty. It was full of realization, reverence, and a profound shift in perspective. The SEAL candidates who had once glanced past him with casual indifference now stood rooted in the presence of something far greater than a war story. They had not just met a man with a past, they had encountered a living example of what it meant to carry that past with integrity. Franklin didn't ask for recognition, and he certainly didn't expect to return. But 3 days later, he found himself back at Precision Point, not out of obligation, but because something inside him had stirred. A purpose he had buried beneath decades of quiet routine had begun to surface again. When he stepped into the facility that afternoon, the atmosphere was different. Staff Sergeant Collins met him at the front desk. "We've been expecting you, sir," he said, handing over a guest badge and a lane assignment card, lane 15. Only this time the card wasn't numbered. It read simply, Franklin Ward Lane. The nameplate had been mounted quietly the evening before. No ceremony, no press, just a screwdriver, a brass plaque, and a quiet consensus among the instructors. What Franklin had given that day wasn't just insight, it was legacy. The young men and women training there needed more than technique. They needed to know what came after. And Franklin had given them that. At first, Franklin hesitated at the new nameplate. "I didn't die," he muttered with a half smile. But the staff only shook their heads. "You lived. That's why it matters." Word of Franklin's story had traveled faster than anyone expected. Within a week, instructors from neighboring bases began asking if he would be willing to speak to their units. 2 former SEALs, now retired, drove up from Camp Lejeune just to shake his hand. Others came not to ask questions, but simply to sit beside him, hoping the quiet might offer clarity. What began as a moment of unexpected vulnerability was rapidly becoming a movement of moral reckoning. The instructors at Precision Point took notice. Training modules were revised. A new section titled Operational Ethics and Moral Burden was added to the SEAL prep curriculum. Franklin's words, "You have to live with the man you see in the mirror," became a featured quote on the classroom wall framed beneath a faded black and white photo of Franklin in his Force Recon days, the tattoo clearly visible. Still, Franklin never saw himself as a teacher. "I just tell the truth," he'd say. "They do what they want with it." But he couldn't deny what was happening. More and more young operators began seeking him out between drills. They didn't ask about tactics. They asked about fear, about regret, about how to return home and not feel lost. Franklin answered as best he could, not with platitudes, but with brutal honesty and hard-earned compassion. "It's not about who you take out," he once told a Delta Force candidate. "It's about who you become in the process and whether you'll recognize yourself when it's over." One by one they came. Some brought coffee, others brought stories. A few just sat quietly next to him, needing nothing more than presence. Eventually, a group of instructors invited Franklin to speak during the ethics capstone course, normally reserved for senior officers and psychologists. He declined at first, but Petty Officer James Carter, who had started it all, convinced him otherwise. "They'll listen to you, Franklin. Not because you tell them what to do, but because you show them who they might become." And so Franklin sat in front of 30 young men and women in combat fatigues and spoke not as a superior, but as a survivor. He didn't sugarcoat the decisions he'd made or the consequences. He didn't hold back the parts that hurt. When one candidate asked how to know what's right in the heat of a mission, Franklin simply said, "Sometimes you don't, but you better hope you've built a conscience strong enough to scream at you anyway." His sessions became a fixture. Not official, but never empty. Even retired operators began to stop by. Green Berets, Recon Marines, PJ medics. They came not for advice, but for truth from someone who had lived the unspoken questions and somehow kept his soul intact. And with each conversation, Franklin's sense of burden began to lighten. For years, he had carried his past like a sealed file, untouched, unreadable, too dangerous to open. But now, by sharing it, by letting others carry the edges of that weight, he found something he hadn't expected: peace. The Franklin Ward Doctrine, as one of the instructors jokingly called it, spread throughout training communities. It wasn't about tactics. It wasn't even about combat. It was about clarity and understanding that strength meant more than force, and that surviving a mission meant more than coming back alive. It meant returning whole if possible, and honest no matter what. By the end of that year, Franklin had quietly become something rare, a living bridge between generations of warfighters. He wasn't a commander or a politician. He didn't write books or give TED Talks. But in that lane at Precision Point and in the minds of those he mentored, he had become something far more enduring: a compass. A few nights before Christmas, James Carter visited Franklin at home. The tree was modest, the living room sparsely decorated. But on the mantel, next to a faded photo of Franklin's old unit, stood a single gift-wrapped box with a note from the guys at Lane 15. Franklin opened it slowly. Inside was a plaque, etched in steel. "True North is rarely loud, but it never fails to point the way." For the first time in years, Franklin let a tear fall freely. And for once, it felt like something had truly come home. Franklin Ward never put on a uniform again. He never stepped back into the classified world he once belonged to, and he never asked for restoration of rank honors or recognition. But somehow, without trying, he became something even more enduring: a cornerstone of quiet strength for those still walking the warrior's path. Though the Ward Doctrine was never formally written, it began echoing across the special operations community like gospel, that true courage isn't blind obedience, but the ability to make the right decision when the cost is everything. It wasn't about defiance, it was about discipline of the soul. Franklin's home became a safe harbor for those carrying invisible wounds. Young SEALs, Green Berets, and Force Recon Marines, some active, some long retired, would drop by with coffee and questions. They came not for war stories, but for the man who had lived them and found clarity on the other side. Franklin never preached. He listened. And when he spoke, it was with the calm authority of someone who had nothing to prove and everything to share. Instructors continued to cite his teachings in ethics classes. His quote etched above Lane 15 became a quiet ritual for new trainees to read before firing: "Make sure you can live with the man you see in the mirror." No one was required to recite it, but most did anyway out of respect. And through it all, Franklin remained the same modest, weathered, steady. He never saw himself as a legend. To him, he was just an old Marine who had made mistakes, lived with consequences, and chose to help others carry their load before it broke them. On his porch one autumn morning, James Carter asked him why he kept doing it. Franklin simply said, "Because someone needs to be the mirror, and I've had a lifetime to polish mine." In a world that too often confuses rank with worth, Franklin Ward reminds us that legacy isn't built through medals or missions. It's built in how you help others face their own.